And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be always acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. Amen. If you are like me, and I think you probably are, you have faced periods in your life where you have been rejected, where people or groups of people have told you, thanks, but no thanks. We don't want you. And in some cases, they don't bother with the politeness. I can remember when I was in college, majoring in journalism, and I got the idea that I would like to intern for the summer with the Associated Press and help them write their stories. You had to take a test to do that. A test I took not once but twice and apparently failed, because both times I was told, thank you, but no thank you. You cannot help us. Rejected. I was rejected in my first job out of college. I was working at a television station in Texas, which was bought out by a group of new owners who then proceeded to fire about half the staff, of which I was one. I don't know if you've ever been fired before, but you feel pretty bad. You feel worthless. You feel rejected. Around that same time, a girlfriend I had been going with for quite some time, very seriously, also told me, thank you, but no thank you. My life is not going to include you from this point forward. And I'm not sure there's anything more devastating than to have someone in a relationship reject you. I went on to Terre Haute, got a job there, and was doing fairly well enough where I decided to apply to bigger stations and try to get a job somewhere else. And I sent some of my work to a talent scout. That's the way you did it then, hoping they would represent me, an agent. And I got a note back from them essentially saying, we're not even sure why you're in the television business. Maybe you should consider another line of work. That's a pretty serious rejection. And then when I got into teaching, college teaching, part of your job as a professor is to conduct research and to publish your research in academic journals. You may have heard that old expression, publish or perish. If you don't do that, you cannot keep your job. And I was fairly successful at that after a time, but in the beginning, I would send papers out and I would get back some pretty harsh rejection letters, essentially telling me, maybe you should consider another line of work because this is so bad. Maybe it was written by the same talent scout I sent the tape to. I'm not sure. I am not telling you all this as a tale of woe or to make you feel sorry for me, but simply to remind you of something you're already well aware of. And that is, life is hard. It is filled with rejection and people telling you, no, we don't want you. And like I said, in many ways, sometimes saying it not so politely. You want to talk about somebody that was rejected. You think about the main character in our Old Testament reading from Genesis, Joseph. You want to talk about rejected. Here's a guy not only rejected by his brothers, but sold into slavery. Joseph, who was the apple of his father's eye, his dad's favorite, who wore that coat of many colors and bragged in front of his brothers decided to do something about it. They didn't just reject him. They captured him, threw him in a hole, and then sold him to slave traders to be taken off to Egypt. And put yourself in Joseph's place for a minute. As you're in that caravan heading to Egypt, your father does not know what's happened to you. He was later told that you were dead. And you're thinking you will never see your home or your family or your friends ever again. You talk about rejection. The good news, of course, is that God does not reject us. Even as Joseph must have felt rejected, and even as we often feel rejected by God for the circumstances that happen in our lives, God has not rejected us. He has not forsaken us. He has not walked away from us. He is always there, even in the midst of a difficult, hard, cruel world filled with rejection and filled with difficult circumstances. God is still there, promising never, ever, ever to walk away from us or reject us. That's what we're seeing in that New Testament reading from Romans chapter 11, specifically verses 1 and 2. God will not, cannot, and does not reject us. Now, there's different ways to look at that. And one of which is one we've already talked about a little bit. God does not reject us even in the midst of what we consider to be horrible circumstances. There are times we may feel like God has walked away from us, times perhaps of health difficulty, relationship problems, money problems, times when we may feel we are completely and totally alone, cut off from everyone and everything, but God will not reject us. He rejects no one. Everyone is equal in His sight. God welcomes all people, and He is there even in the midst of what we perceive to be darkness. And what could be darker than what Joseph walked through and went through at the hands of his brothers? God does not reject us. He didn't reject Joseph. He was just taking Joseph's life and turning it in a different, unexpected way to accomplish His will. What Joseph may have perceived as rejection was God using Joseph to accomplish His will, sending him to Egypt, having him rise to become an important official, having Joseph in charge of the country's food supply, at which point God sent a famine in the region. And it was Joseph and Egypt who were then able to take care of not only themselves and feed themselves, but also to reach out to Joseph's brothers. The same ones who had rejected him were now going to be fed and cared for because of what God had done through Joseph. You may be in the same position as Joseph. You may feel like God has rejected you in your life. You may be going through a dark moment. But remember Joseph and how God used his life not to reject him, but simply to take his life in a different direction to accomplish something wholly and totally unexpected. We all know the story of Joseph and his brothers from the perspective of Joseph. But think of it also from the perspective of the brothers. The brothers, who are now coming hat in hand to Joseph in Egypt for food, have no reason to expect that he should be merciful to them. None whatsoever. And that's why they were terrified when they realized it was Joseph. They had every reason to expect that he could have them banished, he could have them imprisoned, he could have them killed for what they had done to him. They had every reason to believe that Joseph would reject them just as they had rejected him. But God, working through Joseph, does not reject his people, even when they do terrible, horrible, rotten things. And is there anything more terrible and horrible and rotten than what Joseph's brothers did to him? And yet, even in the midst of that, God did not reject Joseph's brothers. He did not reject his people. Despite their great sin, he brought them back in his grace and mercy. And the actions of Joseph, the young boy rejected by his brothers, sold into slavery, is a wonderful picture. It is a wonderful foreshadowing of what we see perfectly fulfilled in Jesus. Joseph, the man rejected by his brothers. Jesus, the man rejected by all. And both of them were able to work God's purpose in showing grace and mercy to those who had rejected them. No matter what you've done, no matter what terrible sins you've committed, God does not reject you and will not reject you as long as you keep coming back to him and his grace and mercy. And there's the catch. God will not reject us. God will never reject his people who put their faith and trust and hope in him, as long as we continue to come to God. God will not reject those who seek his face, who come to him earnestly, honestly, confessing their sins, as big as they may be. God will not reject them. God will only reject those who reject him first. And it is far more likely and far more common for people to reject God than for God to reject anyone. We live in a world filled with rejection. It is a hard, cruel, difficult world in many respects. And I think that's why so many people try to escape it into the world of virtual reality and the internet. I think to a great degree, people go online and into video games and virtual reality because they find so much disappointment, so much difficulty, so much rejection in this world. They want to find a world and create a world where they don't have that rejection. And that's the promise of virtual reality. That's the promise of the internet. That's the promise of going online. You think about Online dating, for example. You can be anybody you want. You can create any kind of personality for yourself, and you don't have to worry about being rejected. You can pick and sift and look through and study, and you don't have to worry about getting shot down because there's always somebody else around the corner. Video games, you can create a world in which you are the complete master. You are in complete control of your environment. You are the Lord and God of your own world, where you never get disappointed, where everything you say goes, and where you never face disappointment or rejection. And think of online interaction in general. Chat rooms, bulletin boards, comment sections. People make up names. They use pseudonyms, phony names. Why? Because they don't have to worry about getting hurt. It's not them who's out there. It's this character they've developed. It's this persona they've invented. And they don't have to worry about getting rejection or getting hurt or getting disappointed. I'm not going to lie to you. And you know this as well as anybody else. It is a hard world out there. It is filled with difficulty and heartache and rejection. But given that, why are so many people reluctant to go to the one place where you will never, ever face rejection? Where you will only encounter love and peace and joy and acceptance. And that is in the presence of God. That does not mean, of course, that you can do anything you want or be anything you want or act any way you want. But putting your faith and trust and hope and lives in the hands of a living God and turning yourself over to Him and giving Him your life and your spirit means you will never ever face rejection again. Because God turns no one away. God does not reject His faithful people. He did not reject Joseph when he was in the midst of his darkness. He did not reject Joseph's brothers, as evil as they acted and as sinful as they were. And He will not reject us if we come to Him. If we come to Him and give Him all of ourselves, we will find total love and peace and joy and, yes, acceptance. Amen.